On December 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov, one of the major figures of the Communist Party and an emerging political force, was murdered in Leningrad. The killing of Kirov by Leonid Nikolaev gave Joseph Stalin the excuse he needed to start what would later be known as the Great Purge, or the Great Terror. This campaign, which took place from 1936 to 1938, involved mass political repression, show trials, and brutal executions aimed at reshaping Soviet society through fear and violence. Immediately following Lenin's death in 1924, the Soviet Union was embroiled in fierce power struggles. By 1929, Joseph Stalin had solidified his control over the Communist Party. With his policies, especially rapid industrialization and forced collectivization, millions died from famine and social upheaval, as seen during the Holodomor in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. This period of economic and social disruption created dissent within the party and society as a whole. By the mid-1930s, as Nazi Germany and militaristic Japan posed growing threats, Stalin's concerns about internal stability peaked. Kirov's assassination provided the reason he needed to eliminate those he considered disloyal. Soon after Kirov's assassination, accusations of a larger conspiracy began to surface. Arrests started with prominent figures who had played key roles in the Bolshevik Revolution. The first wave of show trials began in 1936 with the Trial of the 16, where early allies and later opponents of Stalin, such as Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, were accused of plotting to kill Stalin and collaborating with Leon Trotsky, who was exiled from the Soviet Union. Confessions during these trials were forced through relentless torture and threats. Zinoviev and Kamenev, broken after weeks of interrogation, accused themselves and others of crimes they had not committed. They were executed by firing squad in the early morning, marking the start of a purge that would soon become far more extensive. The Great Purge affected every part of Soviet society. It was a tool of terror that the NKVD, led first by Genrikh Yagoda and later by Nikolai Yezhov, carried out. Yezhov's period in charge saw the peak of the purges, known as Yezhovshchina. Directive number 00447, issued on July 30, 1937, targeted anti-Soviet elements and set quotas for arrests and executions. The NKVD exceeded these quotas with aggressive enthusiasm. Between 1937 and 1938 alone, around 1.3 million people were arrested, and estimates suggest that up to 700,000 were executed. Most of the accused did not face regular courts but instead were judged by troikas or three-person panels that often decided hundreds of cases in a single day, issuing quick death sentences or sending people to labor camps. The show trials were public displays meant to prove the guilt of high-profile figures and reinforce Stalin's absolute power. The second trial, held in January 1937, involved people like Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov, who were accused of conspiring with Trotsky to sabotage Soviet industry and military strength for foreign powers. Despite a complete lack of evidence, most were sentenced to death or long prison terms in the Gulag. The third and most infamous trial took place in March 1938, involving Nikolai Bukharin and Alexei Rykov. Bukharin, a former close associate of Stalin and an intellectual, was accused of leading the bloc of rightists and Trotskyites, which supposedly aimed to overthrow the government and dismantle socialism. Despite eloquently defending himself and pointing out the flaws in the charges, Bukharin was found guilty and executed. The purge extended beyond political figures. In 1937, Stalin turned his attention to the Red Army, which he saw as a potential source of opposition. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the Soviet Union's most talented military strategists, was accused of collaborating with Nazi Germany based on fabricated evidence provided by the German intelligence service. Tukhachevsky and 7 other top officers were arrested and executed. This purge of military leadership severely weakened the Red Army. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the military was unprepared, having lost many of its experienced commanders. Records show that 3 of the 5 marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, and over 150 divisional commanders were either executed or imprisoned. Beyond the political and military spheres, ordinary citizens and entire ethnic groups were targeted. Operations included campaigns against so-called enemies of the people, a term that could apply to anyone, from engineers and factory workers to peasants and intellectuals. Ethnic minorities, especially Poles, Ukrainians, Volga Germans, and Finns, were targeted. The Polish operation of the NKVD led to more than 143,000 arrests and over 111,000 executions. Overall, campaigns against ethnic minorities accounted for a significant share of the Purge's victims, with estimates showing that minorities made up 36% of those executed, despite being only a small part of Soviet society. The equally notorious gulags, or labor camps, were where those spared execution were sent. Here, prisoners endured harsh labor without proper food or adjustment to the severe climates of Siberia and Kazakhstan. Deaths from exhaustion, disease, and starvation were common, adding significantly to the death toll of the Great Purge. In later years, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book The Gulag Archipelago would reveal the horrors faced by prisoners and the scale of state violence and cruelty. The impact of the Purge was vast. Stalin's campaign decimated the old Bolshevik guard that had led the 1917 revolution. Of the 139 Central Committee members elected at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, only 41 were still alive by 1939. The rest had been executed or died in labor camps. The intellectual, cultural, and scientific communities were hit hard. Notable figures like writer Isaac Babel and poet Osip Mandelstam were arrested and either executed or died in camps. Few voices of dissent were left in a society dominated by fear and loyalty to Stalin. The Purge even turned on its own architects. Genrikh Yagoda, who oversaw the early stages of the Purge, was tried and executed as a traitor in 1938. Nikolai Yezhov, who led the NKVD during the most intense period of the Purge, was arrested in 1939, tried and executed in 1940. His downfall showed that even those who enforced Stalin's orders were not safe from suspicion. Yezhov was succeeded by Lavrenti Beria, who reduced the scale of the Purge but continued repression and surveillance until Stalin's death in 1953. Stalin claimed the Purge was necessary to protect socialism from internal and external threats. The term fifth column was often used to label supposed conspirators working against the state. The Purge had a lasting effect. It destroyed any hint of opposition within the party and cemented Stalin's absolute power. However, it also eroded social trust, stifled creativity, and weakened governance. The terror created a society where people were obedient out of fear, knowing that even a slight show of dissent could lead to arrest. After Stalin's death in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev addressed the Purges in a secret speech at the 20th Party Congress, calling them an abuse of power and acknowledging that many victims were innocent. This speech marked the start of Destalinization, an attempt to reduce the cult of personality around Stalin and correct some of the injustices of his rule. Still, the deep scars left by the Purge affect Soviet society for decades. The Great Purge stands as a stark reminder that unchecked power can bring immense human suffering. The countless arrests, executions, and imprisonments highlighted an era where the state turned against its own people with brutal force. Stalin's campaign secured his hold on power, but at the cost of tearing apart the fabric of Soviet society and instilling fear for generations. Thank you for watching. If you found this explanation of one of history's most devastating periods informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more explorations into history's pivotal and often dark moments.